Hi, welcome everybody to Bay Nature Talks. I'm Victoria Schlesinger, the editor of Bay Nature. Bay Nature is a nonprofit independent magazine and website devoted to reporting on the environmental issues of the San Francisco Bay Area, something we've been doing for 22 years. Here is our latest magazine. This is the spring issue, now on magazine newsstands. You can get everything in this issue and really everything we've ever reported on baynature.org for free. Please consider subscribing or donating. We get roughly 50% of our income from donations, so we really appreciate donations, and thank you to everybody who contributed a $20 donation today. It really helps us continue to pay journalists to investigate and report on important issues. So let's see, today we will be speaking to one of those journalists, Erica Gies, who wrote Bay Nature's cover story in our winter issue called Capturing the Floods. And she spoke to UC Davis professor emeritus of hydrology, Graham Fogg, about his work, which is central to the story she wrote. But before we get into inviting our guests on, I'm going to cover some housekeeping. We will first see a short presentation by Erica and then by Graham. And then we will circle back all together and discuss the article, the research, and take questions from the audience for about a half hour. You can send us questions at any point during the presentation conversation using the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll see those questions and we'll try to get to everybody if we can. Please don't use the Q&A function if you're having technical difficulties. Since we're a small organization, we don't actually have the capacity to help you through those technical issues, but rest assured this is being recorded. So we will send out a link to anybody who signed up later on so that you can have a recording of the program in case you weren't able to attend. Let's see. So what we're talking about today is this feature. Beautiful art by Owen Smith, Capturing the Floods. And if you haven't had a chance to read this feature yet, in essence, it's an article about climate adaptation, about California's climate adaptation and how we manage our water for people and the environment as the climate here continues to change. An expert in that subject is our guest, Erica Gies. Erica is a journalist and National Geographic explorer. She writes regularly about water, climate change, plants, animals for Scientific American, the New York Times, The Atlantic, and other illustrious publications like Bay Nature. She has a new book out called Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge with the University of Chicago Press. For details on her new book, please check out her website, slowwater.world. That's slowwater.world, and we'll send out those links later. So Erica is the journalist who wrote this cover story, Capturing the Floods. And that and her book are really the basis for our conversation today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Erica and let her start all of us off with her presentation.
Thank you, Victoria and Bay Nature. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you for having me, and thank you for attending this session. The cover story that Victoria was talking about is derived from my book, Water Always Wins. And I want to tell you a little bit about the premise behind the book, because I think it sets up what's happening in California well. So the reason the subtitle is Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge is because The water detectives I follow in my book, including Graham Fogg, who we're going to hear from in a little bit, are figuring out ways to work with water to soften the impacts of floods and droughts that we're experiencing. So it is a form of climate adaptation, as Victoria was saying. So let me share my screen here. All right. So this is a spot in near Sacramento. Climate change is water change. That is the way that we are starting to see evidence of climate change in our backyards as our cities and agricultural fields flood, or on the flip side, what we're very familiar with in California, longer, more prolonged and serious drought. So the reason for that is, as the climate warms, for every increase in 1 degree Celsius in warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. So that's why we're seeing these really dramatic deluges. And it's also why we're seeing drier, more desiccated landscapes, because the air is evaporating that water out of plants and soil. So already 2 billion people around the world are living with severe or high water insecurity, and that will soon impact 2/3 of the global population. Of course, that's something that we're very familiar with here in the West. The Western United States is currently in a mega drought, which is going on for more than 20 years. And in California, we're experiencing that as longer, more intense droughts, and also bigger atmospheric river storms. California has always gotten these kinds of storms. Sometimes they're called the Pineapple Express. They are really dramatic. They can carry as much water as 15 times the average flow of the Mississippi River. And the number of atmospheric rivers will likely double by 2100 and hold 10 to 40% more water. So that means when we get these big dumps of water, we're more likely to flood because there's more water in the storms happening, falling at a more rapid pace. So it's very critical that we find a way to capture this water because of our longer droughts, but also because we have historically relied on the Sierra snowpack for about 30% of our water, and that is melting as a result of climate change. And so more precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow. That varies from year to year, but the overall trend is downward. And the scientists believe that 80% of the snowpack could be gone by 2100. I should add that water vapor itself is a greenhouse gas, so having more water vapor in the atmosphere also accelerates climate change. However, the problems that we're having with water are not just because of climate change. They also have a lot to do with our development choices. So in kind of standard Western development over the past 150 years, we have had a real ethos of control through concrete, typically dams and levees. And so we've done really dramatic things to the natural water cycle. We filled or drained 87% of the world's wetlands. We've intervened with dams and other infrastructure on 2/3 of the world's major rivers. We've altered 75% of the world's land area. And we're urbanizing rapidly. And as people move to cities and the population grows, just since 1992, the area covered by concrete in cities has doubled. And so California is an epicenter of these problems, and of course has extremely muscular water engineering that moves a lot of water from the north to the south, and generally intervenes dramatically in the water cycle. And one example of that is the Central Valley, which we experience now as a flat farmland, dry except for sprinklers. In fact, used to be a giant inland sea many years. Water would be on the land in some places for 6 months of the year. There were trees and rushes along the rivers, incredible amounts of wildlife. And, we've changed that in order to have the industrial agriculture that we have there today. So this is my book. The American edition is the one with the fish. The other one is the UK edition. And throughout my book, the water detectives, as I call them, which are a lot of people that are doing innovative things with water, they're asking a radical question. Instead of seeking to control water, they're asking, what does water want? And largely what water wants is to reclaim its slow phases that we have erased with a lot of our engineering. So, that's wetlands, that's floodplains, high altitude forests, moorlands. And the idea is that these places are also kind of natural buffers. They absorb water, so they protect us against floods. They also release water slowly, so they make water available to us longer into dry periods. In the West, we tend to think of streams as seasonal, that there's only water in the winter. But in fact, a lot of streams did historically have water in the winter too that was seeping into it from underground. So, one thing that is kind of exciting about these approaches is that we tend to feel really overwhelmed by climate change because it's such a global problem. But water problems are very local, and there's a lot that we can do in our own areas for greater resilience in our own communities and watersheds. And they also help to protect against flooding and drought. And then there can also be a carbon storage component, because a lot of these ecosystems have good rates of carbon storage as well. So the principle that a lot of people in my book are following, I'm calling it slow water. So it's conserving these existing ecosystems that I was talking about: wetlands, floodplains, water towers. It's recognizing that water is an entity with agency. It has its own relationships with rocks, microbes, beavers, humans. And it has its own agenda. And, we see that when we build a development on a wetland and then it floods, or, people who have creeks popping up in their basements. And ideally, slow water solutions are also unique to the place, because every place has its own geology, ecology, and culture. I'm not sure about the time. I think I need to speed up a little bit here. So one of the reasons why healing the hydrology is helpful is because water is, in California, we've come to think of groundwater as a separate source, because, when there wasn't much surface water, people would pump groundwater, and they still do. But as you can see in this diagram, actually surface water and underground water are linked. And when you deplete surface water, groundwater can come up from below if you haven't depleted it as well. And likewise, when you deplete groundwater, that can impact surface water too. And now that California has passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that is forcing local people within a groundwater basin to come together and figure out ways to manage their groundwater sustainably. And in a lot of cases, they're deciding that they want to recharge groundwater, which means actively trying to move water underground, which can mean providing area of land for it to percolate down. It can mean injecting it in wells, which is sometimes done in cities. It's an ancient practice done around the world. In California, people started doing it in the 1920s in certain places where overpumping of groundwater meant that the land was subsiding and falling dramatically. San Jose fell 13 feet before they started recharging. And so this is a growing practice across California and around the world, recharging in various ways. And in California, people have experimented with trying to recharge on farm fields because a lot of the farm fields were historically the floodplain, like I was talking about in the Central Valley. But that can be a little tricky because you don't want to put water on crops at vital times during their growth cycle. You want to be careful that you're not conveying pesticides or fertilizers down into the groundwater, which can happen if you put water on the land shortly after those agricultural practices. So for that reason, that's why the Paleo Valleys described in this article are so exciting. They were formed by glaciers. They're underneath the surface of the valley, but close to the surface. And basically they're historic riverbeds that were carved by these ancient glacial fed rivers and then filled with cobble, which is a very porous material. I'm getting the ding that I need to move on, so I'm going to try and speed through this, and Graham will fill you in on a lot of the other stuff about how these paleo valleys work and how they were formed. But the idea is if we can capture the rains from our big floods that are happening, the big atmospheric rivers, and move them atop this area that's super porous, the water can move underground really quickly, which will alleviate the floods and then seep into the surrounding clay more slowly, which will raise the groundwater table and allow people to access that water through wells. It'll help to heal the hydrological cycle, make more water available in the dry season as well. They used to be found with this very slow process where people would study soil cores taken when drilling wells. But so far we've only been able to find 3 because it's such a slow process. And the exciting thing about the underground is that it's predictable. We know that there are paleo valleys for all of these waterways coming off of the Sierra because they were caused by this historic episode, and therefore they're predictable and we should be able to find them. So now the state is using a new technology, using a helicopter, something called Airborne Electromagnetic surveys. And I won't talk about it in much depth since we're running out of time, but you can read more about it in the article. And basically it allows the researchers to get a picture of the underground, and then they can create these 3D maps that look like this, which show the red areas are actually the very porous places. And so if you can direct water, say here over the very porous area of red, then the idea is it will move underground quickly. So without further ado, I will pass the torch to Graham and let him tell you more about paleo valleys and all of their cool aspects.
Good day. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and it's really an honor to be featured in this chapter of Erica's and to talk about it with you folks today. And I need to share my screen, which I will get around to doing. Okay, yeah, so I'm a professor of hydrogeology at UC Davis, and been studying groundwater in the subsurface actually for more than 45 years. So I'm going to talk about what these deposits are and how they form and why they're important and actually why they're predictable. Some key storage numbers, and Erica touched on these in terms of the water storage in the Central Valley. Key numbers are the historical snowpack, which has on average amounted to 17 million acre feet in a given year. The reservoirs can store about 42 million acre feet, and historically we've worked with these. the snow melts to fill up the reservoirs and supply the water when we need it. And that has, in general, worked pretty well. Let me turn on the laser pointer. Problem with this is the reservoirs, if we have more than a 2 or 3 or 4 year drought, the reservoirs get extremely depleted. So the water security we get from these reservoirs, even though it's a lot of capacity, is not adequate, especially with climate change, with the snowpack diminishing, and us getting more precipitation as rain rather than snow. Another big number, which is this third one down here, is 140. And there's a groundwater basin picture behind that. That's the space in the Central Valley subsurface, which represents the room for additional water. So the space for additional water is more than 3 times the total capacity of the surface reservoirs in California. So if you're looking for places to put water, obviously it's underground. And this 140 has resulted due to groundwater overdraft. That is working mainly at pumping groundwater rather than replenishing it. This change that we're trying to get California and other places to initiate is a massive undertaking. It's going to require orders of magnitude more recharge than what we've ever done, more than what we've ever imagined, in order to hedge our bets and adapt to the coming water pressures coming with climate change. So that's the challenge. How to get more water underground, how to use even a fraction of this huge space that's available underground for storing water. This story is mainly for the Central Valley. I'll refer to the Central Valley floor. I assume the audience is familiar with the Sierra Nevada and southern Cascade ranges right here. This basin, the Central Valley, is a sedimentary basin. It contains thousands of feet of sediments deposited mainly by rivers coming off the Sierra Nevada and coast ranges. The story here today is about the glaciation of the Sierra Nevada and how it affected these rivers and alluvial fans that fill in the east side of the Central Valley and turn out to be so important for future water management and storage. And you've seen this picture. This is a nice depiction by Bay Nature's artist, Michelle Buziak, where she was very patient working with me in critiquing what things actually look like. So there's this Paleo Valley, which is a big sand and gravel body that extends up in this direction in the subsurface. But actually, all the aquifer portions in the Central Valley subsurface that we regard as aquifers are paleo channels or paleo valleys deposited by ancient rivers. They're smaller, though. What makes these big and shallow and so important, and what makes them predictable? And that's part of the geologic story. Now, when people talk about recharge, we commonly look at pictures like this. We conceptualize the subsurface as kind of a big pile of sand, and maybe the artist throws in a clay layer there just for posterity and so on. But it looks nothing like that, especially in the Central Valley. The myth there is that aquifer systems of the Central Valley are mostly sand and gravel. That's not true. It's a myth. Actually, the reality is, which seems completely counterintuitive, is that they're mostly what we call the non-aquifer materials, that is silt and clay, which hold water, but they don't transmit the water very readily. Here's a quick depiction of a carefully done model based on a lot of data of a portion of the Central Valley near Woodland, California. And here, the aquifer portions are the yellow and the red. Apologies if the colors are confusing, but the yellow and the red are the aquifer portions. This thing that's labeled clay here, which is purple, is non-aquifer. So it holds water, but it transmits it much more slowly. And what we see in most of the Central Valley is that most of the system, and in this case it's about 70% of the system, is clay. And in most of Yolo County, where Woodland is, it's more like 80% clay, but it's a major aquifer system. So here's the riddle. How can you have these seemingly disconnected blobs of aquifer material and still have a major aquifer system? Well, the answer to the riddle is that they're connected. And the way to picture that is the subsurface in systems like the Central Valley does consist of these networks of channels. It's almost like visualizing the artery and vein network in the human body, where the arteries and veins are very well connected. They're surrounded by lots of tissue that's mostly water, but it moves much more slowly than in the veins and the arteries. But of course, those arteries and veins are connected, so you can get lots of fluid movement. So this is the way to think of these systems. And you can imagine if you're trying to recharge this system and you're trying to do it here or there, you're not getting the needle, so to speak, into the artery to accomplish the recharge. So these things, if we can identify them, know where they are, give us a leg up, and could be really leveraged to enhance recharge. So let's look at how they formed. They formed from glaciation. So what, I think most people are familiar that North America, maybe from remembering your 8th grade science class, North America had continental glaciers that extended all the way up to where Erica is in north and into northern US. And in California, we had what are known as alpine glaciers that covered the Sierra Nevada right there. And here's a more close-up view of the area of the Sierra Nevada that was heavily glaciated. And by the way, at that time, sea level was more than 400 feet lower than it is today because of all the water that went into glacier ice around the world. So with this glaciation, you see these rivers that drain the Sierra Nevada. They were all influenced, and hence the formation of the aquifer system that they formed were influenced by these glacial processes. So let's look at those. Oh, and there were multiple glacial epochs in the last 500,000 years. There were at least 4 or 5. So today, we're in what's known as an interglacial. So we're not in a glacial period. But some 15 to 10,000 years ago, we transitioned out of a glacial period. So the most recent glacial period was right here. So let's envision what the Central Valley looked like between today and back thousands of years ago with this most recent glacial period. So 15 to 18,000 years ago, if you looked at the Central Valley, this is a schematic, obviously. And here's a river coming out of the Sierra Nevada. And the river is incised. Well, why did they incise? Well, multiple reasons. But one reason that's relevant is sea level was 400 feet lower. That helped geomorphically result in some river incision, plus the change in sediment load in the rivers also affected what they did. But they incised a lot. So had you been on the valley floor back then, you would see these little mini canyons, if you will, of up to 100-foot deep incisions along the major rivers draining the Sierra Nevada. So this is with the glaciers up in the mountains and the glacial maximum. Now let's picture what happens when the glaciers melt. And when the glaciers melt, they move tons of water and tons of sediment, a lot of it coarse-grained sediment, sands and gravels that are good aquifer materials. So here's sea levels up. And this would be 10,000 to 15,000 years ago when the glaciers are melting. The glaciers melted, and what happened was these valleys, which we're referring to as Paleo Valleys, filled up with extraordinarily coarse material almost all the way to the surface. And the modern day surface has additional soils on top of this that cover these things up, but we can find some of these in the subsurface if we're careful. So if you're trying to recharge this system that's mostly not aquifer, but it's a major aquifer system, these afford access. And we need to move a lot of water. We need to accomplish a lot of recharge, so these are obviously a benefit. Just to put more of a picture to it, here's, during peak glaciation or near peak glaciation, Yosemite Valley has been depicted to have been filled up with thousands of feet of glacier ice. And here's an artist's rendition of that. And there's Half Dome for reference. And when the glaciers melt, I'm just showing a picture of the Athabasca Glacier, which is a strongly receding glacier up in Canada along the Columbia Icefields Parkway. It's a great visit if you have an opportunity. So this glacier is melting, and what happens to the streams when the glaciers are melting? Well, during that phase two, the rivers in the Central Valley would not have looked like they did today. They would be choked with lots of sand and gravel, which tends to form braided streams, such as shown here. You wouldn't have had the mountains in the Central Valley floor, but this is the best edition of a rendition of a braided system I could show. So this sort of thing happened along all the major river systems that go to the Sierra Crest. Not all of them do, but many of them do, along this east side of the Central Valley. And I'm going to show you a picture of the southern portion, the San Joaquin Valley portion of this, where it shows the rivers where we know geologically, so Calaveras, Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and so on, Kings River, Cahuilla, these systems we know should have those incised valley fill deposits. That's our geologic term for it. The more friendly term that we're using now is Paleo Valleys, which I like, by the way. So the frustrating thing is only 3 have been discovered. We know, so there's multiple ones out there. These are major features for recharge, but they're mostly unknown. Are they unknown because the methods people have been using are slow? That's part of it, but it's mostly because California has not heretofore devoted much effort to finding these things. It's more of an effort problem than the methods, although the newer methods that we have now are helpful. So we found one. My student, PhD student, Gary Wiseman, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, found one along the Kings River fan and mapped it in detail, published a lot of papers on it. I went on lecture tour and lectured about this. This one runs from south of Sanger to across the northern portion of Del Rey. We mapped it, used subsurface data to identify this. We did a three-dimensional characterization of what the valley would have been, the incision that was backfilled, and here's a cross-section showing this deposit, which on lecture tour I emphasized 20 years ago that this is incredible resource or resources for recharge, and by the way, most of them are undiscovered, so we didn't need to get onto it. The word was spread, but sometimes academic discoveries take a while to mature and be implemented, so hopefully now they are. So that's the origin of these. And again, all these are paleo channels. That's a paleo channel, Paleo Valley. But these are just much smaller, and they're not shallow, and they're not as massive as these special ones that we're talking about. A key part of the puzzle here is there are a bunch of these features out there beneath the Central Valley floor, but what does it mean that you don't know where most of them are? Well, it creates a land use nightmare. So cities have been built over these things. Sacramento is an example. Orchards have been built over them. They have served as pathways for groundwater contamination, partly because of that. And then if you're lucky, there's areas in the Central Valley where there's accessible land. So that now there's a scramble to both identify these and to deal with the land use dance that it's going to take to reconsider how we value subsurface characteristics. I call these the Yosemite Valleys of recharge, in that if you knew where they were and you understood their potential consequences, you would look at them perhaps as like park resources that are unique resources worthy of preservation. So there's been some discussion of creating recharge preserves that capitalize on unique aspects of the subsurface. But the subsurface is largely invisible, out of sight, out of mind. So that's a problem. We have also, the USGS has found some of these features along the Stanislaus fan near Modesto, and we found one on the American River. This is Sacramento area is right here. I'm sitting somewhere in here right now, actually. And this red is an incised valley fill deposit or Paleo Valley deposit, or a couple of them, associated with the American River when it used to flow this way. Today, the American River flows like that, but it used to come right down here because sea level was lower and it was discharging to the delta over here. So it did that. And here's just another depiction of one of these, just to make the point that, oh yeah, we found another one. And again, what's happening along this? Erica and I took a nice drive on a field trip along here some months ago. And what's a dominant land use here? Well, gravel mining. The gravel miners have found these, and those gravel pits could serve as nice recharge locations. So to wrap up, what's the state doing about this? Well, it's actually really encouraging that a lot is happening. And one is there's a renewal of interest in just subsurface mapping, spurred by Sigma, and the realization that California has neglected this aspect of its subsurface in the past. It hasn't really had to focus so much on groundwater as it has recently. So that's a shift, an important one. Erica mentioned the AEM, Airborne Electromagnetic Geophysical Surveys, to help map and identify these things. These hold a lot of promise for indicating where the rest of these features are and coming up with a better subsurface map for the Central Valley. And then there's the state actually restructured. I've been pushing on this for some time, and they listened. There's a new unit within the California Geological Survey to perform subsurface mapping in support of geohazards and groundwater resource management. And there's not a website yet, but there's this nice two-pager fact sheet that they've put out for the California Geological Survey on what they're doing. So I'm going to wrap up there. I think I probably went over a little bit, but I hope to entertain questions. Let me know if I should stop my screen share or what I'm supposed to do now.
Okay, thanks, Graham. And we are going to welcome Erica back on so that three of us can chat. Thank you, both of you. This is, I have been working with Erica on this article and Graham on and off on the Aquifer system graphic for months, and I still learned new things. So this is great. And before we get into some of the specifics about groundwater recharge, I just wanted to step back for a second. And Erica, can you talk a little bit about the ecological benefits of groundwater recharge? There's a little passage in your story I'm going to read from. And if you could expand on this and some of the other benefits, I think Bay Nature readers would appreciate this. You write about how gravity pulls water towards the center of Earth. When it reaches certain depths, hydraulic pressure can drive the water upward. This phenomenon feeds springs, perennial flowing creeks, and most wetlands, which would not survive without upward flowing groundwater. So I think this is a concept most people aren't familiar with, and it really bears a little exploration.
Yeah, I think, what Graham said about the underground being out of sight, out of mind, I think it's really true. People don't think about it much. And if they do think about it, I think most people don't really understand the importance. But the vast majority of fresh water is actually underground. And so it, like in my picture that showed the surface and the underground, it's a connected system in most places. And so, what you do to surface water can affect groundwater, and what you do to groundwater can affect surface water. So the way that we've overpumped groundwater in recent decades means that, I talked about how the streams, some streams actually used to be year round, and now they're not. That also applies to certain vernal pools and wetlands. And so, as those wetlands dry out, either seasonally or permanently, the species that rely on that type of ecosystem, like fairy shrimp and all kinds of cool things, they no longer have a place to live, basically. So that's one aspect of it. Another thing is, in California, there's been this real like fish versus farmers argument that, we can't afford to save water for the river and aquatic life because farmers need it and some farmers are having to go without. But in fact, if you heal the hydrological system to the extent you can, if you can, store your water underground, like we're talking about here, that supplies so much to wildlife. A good example is floodplain reclamation, and they've done some studies near Sacramento where actually, if you allow salmon fry to hang out on a flooded floodplain, they are 12 times fatter, I think is the statistic. And it's because, in the shallow warm water, algae grows and plankton and, all the levels of the food web. And so if you have healthier salmon, you don't need separate dedicated water for the fish. Like the same water can help both the ecosystem, and then later in the cycle can go to humans, and then ideally back underground.
Yeah. Thank you. So, and I'm just going to do my journalist thing here. In hearing everything that you both have just said, who could be against this? Who could not be in support of groundwater recharge in California? Is there somebody that doesn't want this?
Well,
and what would the reason possibly be?
So those who forget might be against, but also those who don't think they necessarily need it, or whose concept of water storage is based on the traditional notion of you build a structure, a dam, and you fill it up. And that is simpler. And politicians love it because they can cut one ribbon and they're done practically, although it's expensive to maintain those over time. But in terms of remembering, what people don't really know and don't remember because they probably never knew it is the Central Valley used to be 20% wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a myth that those disappeared because farmers drained the land. Well, that's a myth. The wetlands went away because we pumped groundwater. That lowered the water table to where we are now, such that there's only about 2% of the surface area in the Central Valley that is wetlands. So wherever you have wetlands, wherever you have streams that are running year-round, they're doing that by virtue of groundwater discharge to the surface. Yeah. And where does the water want to go? Erica alluded to it. 97% of all liquid fresh water on Earth is groundwater, not soil water, not above the water table, but in groundwater. So that is where the water wants to go, but we've been pumping it out much harder than we've been allowing the system to replenish, or much harder than we've been actively replenishing it.
I just want to add something about can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to add on Graham's statement about politicians liking dams. I mean, it's true. You have a big piece of infrastructure you can point to. And I think there's been this idea that, where everybody is kind of fighting for every last molecule of water in California. There's this idea, you put it underground and some of it will be lost, to the environment. So, as we've been talking about, that's actually not a loss. It's a plus because the whole system can be healthier in that way and supply more to everyone. But also, there's a lot of loss in reservoirs. A really large amount actually is evaporated. And some of it also goes to the underground. So this idea that a dam is like a secure source of water and putting it underground is not secure is also sort of an illusion.
Yeah, it's true. There's some losses, but as Erica was saying, there's the benefit to ecosystems. And in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's 6 undesirable effects that the act is intending to avoid. One of them is damage to groundwater dependent ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So one way to avoid that damage is to keep groundwater levels high enough.
One other thing about who would be against it, like Graham's example of the Paleo Valley that his student found near Sacramento, he said, people don't, see the need to store water so much in Sacramento, and that's true because it tends to be a very water-rich place. But in that example also, somebody's planning to build a housing development on that land. And so it's a case where, they've already planned it to some degree. And so they kind of want to go ahead with it. So there can be those competing land uses, which are problematic, which Graham referred to as well.
And the county's been planning to do that for decades. And they don't want to change their mindset.
The passage in Erica's article where she mentions that you actually have been talking to Tim Washburn, Graham, with the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, right? About there's the Sacramento Paleo Valley right there by the Folsom South Canal, right? And that so I have 2 questions, and then we have some really sophisticated questions in our Q&A, and then I'll try to shift us to those. But just to bring the idea here full circle, so you have the Folsom Canal, which is already a facility channeling a great deal of water. You have the Sacramento Paleo Valley adjacent to it. So what is the infrastructure needed to actually make that happen, to get the water into the Sacramento Paleo Valley? And what I really like about Erica's reporting and here is that there isn't just one answer to that. But why don't you give a couple answers to what's the on the ground practical stuff that needs to happen?
Well, one answer would be to build retention basins to pond the water on top of that feature. That's done in groundwater recharge operations. This could be a really big one because it's a big paleo valley and it's very permeable and it connects into the deep subsurface. So we've modeled that and how much additional water you could put underground, and it's practically like building another Folsom Lake.
Wow.
But without the dam and without the environmental negatives. So I asked people if you could have another Folsom Lake without the dam and without the cost and the environmental negatives, would you want it? And people say, well, of course. But there's these land use restrictions. So what Tim and others are trying to move ahead with is something more conservative, or a smaller project which involves injecting water into dry wells, essentially big holes in the ground that can receive water from Folsom South Canal into dry wells to initiate recharge. Those can be effective. You need a lot of them. You're not going to move the major amounts of water that could potentially be received in a paleo valley like that. So, and another opportunity would be building housing projects with groundwater recharge greenbelt features. So there's the possibility of that. The downside of that is an actual operating groundwater recharge basin, and places like Orange County are very good at this, but they operate them, but they have to go in and scrape them out after every major flood or inundation event to get the silts out to maintain the infiltration capacity. So you couldn't do something like that if it's in a nice green belt housing development per se.
Right.
But you could probably still reap benefits by being able to create ponds that are leaky in a system like that and maintain the water in the ponds long enough for it to soak in and eventually get down into the Paleo Valley.
Several people have asked who are fans of your idea and the work that both of you are doing, how to support these ideas. What are some initiatives in California that are looking at this? How can they get behind what you're doing?
Well, the Department of Water Resources has funneled $12 million from one of the recent bond measures to hunt for more paleo valleys and other underground features by the Airborne approach. And they're making that data available on a rolling basis over the next 3 years. They're studying 100 of the more impacted water subbasins, like where people have pumped out too much groundwater. So part of Sigma involves these groundwater sustainability agencies where you get together with people in your watershed. So, you know, typically that probably means growers and city decision makers. So maybe not everybody, but those people can get this data, find out if there are any paleo valleys in their own area. They might need to do some additional research to find out more of their characteristics and how they might use them for groundwater recharge. And then, you know, support that particular land use if it comes to that. I think for the general public, the more that people are aware of this as a possibility, you know, they can advocate for that in their city council meetings and on the ballot when things come up, and just, you know, understand what this approach is and how useful it can be.
Yeah, on that last point, I think advocating for not just the knee-jerk build another reservoir solution. There is a place for that. I'm not saying all reservoirs are bad, and in fact, storing water in the reservoirs can help you have enough water down the road for recharging groundwater, depending on how you're operating the basin. But you know, reminding your politicians when they say we need to build that dam, remind them that the amount of water storage you will get from that is a drop in the bucket compared to the available storage space underground in most cases.
And also most rivers in California that can be dammed already have been dammed. And the environmental restrictions on building new dams are more intense than they were, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago when a lot of these were built. So it's very difficult to build new dams because there isn't room for them, and it's a higher hurdle. So that's just not an option that can meet the current need.
There's also organizations like River Partners, which I'm not very close to that organization, but I've just started to read a little bit about them. But they work on river restoration, but one of their people talk about multi-benefit operations now, one of which being river restoration. It can include floodplain restoration, which can enhance groundwater recharge. So I understand that California state parks may be engaging in some interesting cooperative ventures with a fair amount of new investment from the state to building refugia parks along major rivers of the Central Valley floor for purposes of natural system restoration and recharge. So,
And I think that's also part of the state's newer approach to flood management as of 2017. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, using floodplains as floodplains where possible to absorb floods and
letting floodplains flood.
Yes.
I'm going to try to get to at least one of our questions here because I know we're running out of time. We could talk for another hour easily. But here's one, somebody, Rachel, who asks, how would agricultural practices need to change to increase the water flowing into paleo valleys where the agriculture overlies those paleo valleys?
Well, the farmers could engage in fallow recharge in winter if they have water. So a number of farmers are doing that. They don't, as far as I know, they don't know whether they're on top of paleo valleys. But even if you don't do it on top of paleo valleys, it's likely to create a significant benefit. So my colleague at UC Davis, Dr. Helen Dalka, works very much on this topic, which is called AGMAR, Agricultural Managed Aquifer Recharge, which involves farmers using their irrigation infrastructure, but in the off-growing season. And Erica referred to this also. So they can do that if they have the water. The state is helping farmers find pathways toward gaining the water rights to winter floodwaters. You don't want to divert all the water because some of those floodwaters have ecological benefit downstream. But what we're talking about is just taking the top 10% of the flood flows, which is a lot of water, and trying to recharge that.
And also some of the areas that are being farmed in California right now may not be in the future. I mean, some land has turned saline from too much irrigation, so that's having to be fallowed anyway. But also, you know, as we make different choices with water usage going forward, certain very thirsty crops are being phased out and substituted for other crops. And, you know, some land is being turned to other purposes or restored ecologically. So if you did find a really great Paleo Valley, you know, and a farmer was ready to get out of the business, you know, that could be an opportunity to create one of those conservation recharge zones like Graham was talking about.
Right, right. And there are concerns about groundwater quality, about recharging, mobilizing contaminants that are there from industrial or agricultural sources. Probably someone's asked 5 questions on this in the list that I haven't been able to get to. And that is a concern. Keep in mind that under irrigation, there's water moving to the water table all the time anyway. So there are contaminants being mobilized all over the place because of the way we use lands and because of the way we have to conduct agriculture. So there will be areas where some of that will be sped up. What we envision, you know, 50, 100 years from now is the water quality in a basin like this will have to be monitored, and you're going to have giant bubbles of relatively clean water amidst some areas where the groundwater quality is much worse. And the system will have to be managed smartly based on knowledge of where's the water and where's the different water quality, you know, bubbles in these systems.
Let's see. We have a question from Thomas who says, how do confined and unconfined aquifers figure into this? I'm not familiar with those terms.
Yeah, so these sedimentary systems are what we call semi-confined. That means the wells that are drilled to intermediate and deep depths into them respond like confined aquifers. So I'm assuming the questioner understands what a confined aquifer is. So confined aquifers respond a lot more quickly to groundwater pumping and recharge, but they're more isolated from recharge because of all the clay beds that separate them from the surface. So these systems don't necessarily have an identifiable confining bed, which is the classical textbook definition of a confined aquifer, but they behave very confined because of all the fine-grained interbeds in them. So it's actually its own kind of hydraulic system, but it's quite common in sedimentary basins. The textbooks actually haven't really caught up with that yet, but they will.
So we are actually out of time. It's 5 o'clock. This went really fast. And I know there are a lot of questions we didn't get to, so I apologize for that, but I hope people took a good bit of new information from this. There's the magazine article to check out on Bay Nature's website. If you don't get the magazine, there's Erica's forthcoming book. Graham, do you have any other ways in which people can follow your work?
I'm a abject failure at putting things on the web. I'm trying to change that, even though I'm emeritus. But I do have a website where you can access some of my publications. You can go on ResearchGate and find my publications, or Google Scholar, and find them, or you can email me and I can send you things.
Okay, so with that, we're going to need to conclude. And thank you, Erica and Graham, for sharing this, really complex knowledge and information with all of us lay people. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing where this all goes.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great questions.
Thanks. So everyone, that concludes the Bay Nature Talk. We want to thank everybody again who donated. We really want to thank the David Brower Center who handled all our tech needs during this process, and know that early next week you will get an email from Bay Nature with a link to the recording if there are things that you want to see or listen to again, and of course share that. We will include links to Erica's website. I'm going to take a look at ResearchGate and see if I can't find some links to send you all to keep in touch with Graham. So sorry we couldn't answer everybody's questions, but this is a subject that Bay Nature will certainly continue to follow. So thank you again. We appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. Take care.